So when we last left off, we were talking about the afterlife in ancient Egypt, Mortuary Ritual, right? And this lecture on YouTube now is going to cover the rest of ancient Egypt. And again, I want to thank those of you who were able to make it out to the King Tut exhibit. You know, I think it was good. I think it was worth it. Might as well, since it's here in town. But you know, that means that we have to cover the rest of ancient Egypt this way. But you know, feel free to get through this lecture, you know, a little bit at a time, all at once, whatever you need to do. Okay, so we said that in the pre-dynastic period, most ancient Egyptians were buried in the ground, and the heat of the desert sand, the dry conditions in ancient Egypt naturally preserve people, right? So you can see this is a pre-dynastic burial, and you can see the flesh, the skin is preserved, perfectly preserved on this individual. Problem is, when they started burying people in tombs, those tombs, you know, trapped in the humidity, and so they had to figure out another way of preserving bodies. And your body had to be preserved in order for your Ka and your Ba to basically recognize your body in the tomb. So the ancient Egyptians came up with mummification, the process of mummification. And mummification was for anyone in ancient Egypt who could afford it, right? So it wasn't just for pharaohs. It was for nobles, it was for scribes, it was priests, anyone who had the means to pay people in the temple to be mummified could be mummified, right? And the way it was done was first, your body would be brought to the temple. Priests would make an incision in your abdomen, you could see here, and they'd remove your internal organs. They remove your lungs, your liver, your intestines, and your stomach. They would leave your heart in place because they thought that was the seat of all knowledge, emotions, etc. The brain they thought was a useless organ, and so what they would do is they would scramble up the brain with a metal rod, and they would essentially pour out the brain through the nasal cavity. Then they would place those internal organs into these canopic jars that you can see here. Each of these canopic jars has the head of a god, and these four gods are the sons of Horus. Remember, we talked about Horus, who the pharaoh was considered to be during life. So you have a falcon-headed canopic jar, jackal-headed canopic jar, a baboon-headed canopic jar, and a human-headed canopic jar. And I kind of have a mnemonic device to remember which organ goes in which canopic jar. You know, obviously you won't have to remember this, but if you ever want to impress people, the way I usually do it is, you know, I think of liver. When I think of liver, I think of cirrhosis of the liver. Who gets cirrhosis? People from drinking too much alcohol, so the liver goes in the human-headed jar. Baboons. When I think of baboons, I think of really loud animals. You need a good pair of lungs to be loud, so the lungs go in the baboon-headed jar. When I look at the falcon-headed jar, I think of a bird. Whether some birds eat worms, which organ looks like a worm? The intestines. So the intestines go in the falcon-headed jar, and that leaves the stomach in the jackal-headed jar. So there's a cool little mnemonic, well, cool in quotation marks, mnemonic device that you can use to impress everyone. And then what they would do is they would lay out the body on a stone slab, and they would cover it with natron salt. It's a natural salt that occurs in Egypt. They would pour it all over the body and let it sit there for 40 days. And basically the salts would suck out any moisture that was in the body and allow the body to be perfectly preserved. Natron salt is a little bit like baking soda. So if you want to try this out on your own, take a piece of chicken or take a piece of leather, right? Cover it with baking soda, right? And you'll see that the baking soda will basically dry out that that organic piece, and it will be completely dry. It will turn into something like jerky. It will be perfectly preserved. Now, this individual you see here is actually the body of someone who donated their remains to scientific research after they passed away, and this Egyptologist basically went through the process of mummification to see how it would have occurred in ancient Egypt. Then usually what would happen is you'd be wrapped in linen bandages. Within those linen bandages you would have amulets like this, right? So these amulets would be used to protect you, allow your soul to reach the afterlife. If you were extremely wealthy, each arm, each finger even, would be wrapped individually in linen bandages. If you were a little less well-to-do, they might just put your hands at your sides and wrap you around, kind of like the toilet paper game that you see people playing sometimes. Just start at the feet and wrap all the way to the head. And then the person would be covered in a plaster, almost like a cast, with a face mask or a death mask on top, so that your soul could recognize you in the afterlife. And then you would be placed in your tomb. Right? And here you can see this is a priest wearing a mask of Anubis. Anubis was the god of mummification, being placed on a bed, kind of like the beds you saw in the King Tut exhibit, in the tomb. And at the funeral, the priest would conduct a funeral, and you could hire professional mourners, right? These are women who are hired to be mourners, who would throw ashes on their head, cry, right? Make a good show, make it seem like you're really going to be missed. And then one of the last ceremonies was the opening of the mouth, where they would symbolically open the mouth of your mummy, and your soul, your ka and your ba, would be able to leave your body. And then your descendants, your relatives, could bring offerings to your tomb. And in the afterlife, and this is something else you saw in the King Tut exhibit, many people who were buried in these tombs had Shapti figurines, and these were magical figurines that came to life after you died, and that would serve you in the afterlife. So they're basically servants that you took with you in the afterlife. In the pre-dynastic and the very beginning of the Old Kingdom, there were sacrificial burials, like in the royal tombs of Ur. So some of the royal personages early on did have sacrificial burials, but this did not last. It disappeared, and some people think that what replaced it were these Shapti figurines, so symbolic figurines that would magically come to life as your servants in the afterlife. Probably the most famous tombs, of course, are the pyramids. The pyramids date to the Old Kingdom. Right, so the period right after Narmer. This is the period, the first unified state in Egypt. Right, and we're going to talk a little bit now about the pyramids. The pyramids are right outside of Cairo in a town called Gizeh. This is where the most famous pyramids are. The pyramids are pretty amazing. I had the chance to see the pyramids when I was in Egypt. To say they're enormous is really not is kind of understating it. The tallest pyramid is 481 feet high, has 2 million stones. Right? Before the Eiffel Tower was built in the 1800s, the Great Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt was the tallest building in the world. Right? It's the only wonder of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that remains to this day. There's a lot of misconceptions about the pyramids. Obviously, if you watch the History Channel, what they say is that the pyramids are evidence of ancient aliens. Right? And basically the argument is this. They look at the complexity of the pyramids, they look at the size of the blocks, and they assume there's no way that ancient people could have done it. Right? So they already start out with this false assumption. People could not have built the pyramids. Okay, if they couldn't build the pyramids, then who could have? And they fill this in with this fanciful theory that extraterrestrials from other planets came down and brought advanced technology and helped ancient Egyptians build the pyramids. Okay. And so they're starting out with a false premise, because all the evidence, as you're going to see, shows that the Egyptians built the pyramids. And basically people just have to face up to the fact that the ancient Egyptians were very intelligent, very advanced in terms of organization. They didn't need cranes. They didn't need very complex math. They used simple mathematics and geometry. But really what their genius was they had the organization to take thousands of people and focus them on one massive building project. Right? That's really the genius behind the pyramids, not some incredible sci-fi technology. And we're going to talk more about these alien theorists. Right? The most famous book about ancient aliens is this book, Chariots of the Gods. It was written by someone named Erich von Däniken. Chariots of the Gods, at least from the last time I looked it up, has sold more copies than every archaeology book ever published put together. Right? So that's kind of depressing when you think about it. The way the alien theories kind of work basically is what I like to call Rorschach archaeology, like the Rorschach test, the ink blots. A psychologist will give you the Rorschach test and say, what does this look like to you? You tell the psychologist what you think it looks like, and then they're able to evaluate you. It's kind of the same thing. Erich von Däniken looks at these ancient artifacts, ancient tomb paintings, things like that, and says, okay, what does this look like to me? Right? And really, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it looks like to a modern person. What matters is what the ancient people were trying to communicate. So, for example, this image here from ancient Egypt, Erich von Däniken said this looks a lot like a light bulb, right? It's, the same shape. It's got this thing that looks like a filament in the middle. The ancient Egyptians, this might be evidence that the ancient Egyptians had light bulbs, right? And what this is, based on everything that Egyptologists have studied, is this is a depiction of a lotus flower before it opens up, right? So, again, what does it look like to you? That sometimes that doesn't really matter, actually. It's what the ancient people were trying to depict in their artwork. Another misconception is that the pyramids were built by slaves. Right? And this misconception probably derived from conflating the Exodus story with the construction of the pyramids. The time period of the Exodus is 1300 BC. The time period of the pyramids is around 2700 BC, so it's much earlier. All the evidence shows that it was not slaves who built the pyramids, but it was essentially paid workers. Some of these people who worked to build the pyramids were there the full year round, full-time employees. Some of them were seasonal employees, right? That is, they were farmers who during the off-season would work for the pharaoh on these construction projects. And of course, between the harvest, after they've harvested the wheat, and before the planting season, there's a little bit of a break when, let's say, farmers are not working intensively in the fields. And this provided them the opportunity of working on these large construction projects. Okay, so what's the evidence that of how the pyramids were formed, how they were built, where the idea came from, the shape, etc.? Well, it all derives from the very earliest Egyptian tomb form called a mastaba. A mastaba is essentially a building that's marking the location of an underground burial. Some of these mastabas could be enclosed by a wall with a stela or stone sculpture in front. People could bring offerings to it. Right? And so these mastabas, over time, and this we're talking about the pre-dynastic phase, into the beginnings of the Old Kingdom, became a little bit more elaborate over time. So they started to stack one mastaba on top of another, a double-decker mastaba. You can see here made out of stone. All right, and this continued until the pharaoh Djoser. Right? And Djoser essentially wanted a 6-stepped mastaba, which became the first pyramid. Right? So his architect designed a 6-step mastaba. You can see here it's 60 feet high. This was one of the first really large stone constructions in the ancient world. And when they designed this, they actually built this stepped pyramid. It's called the Step Pyramid of Djoser. They completed it before the pharaoh died, and so they spent the remainder of Djoser's life enlarging the pyramid till its final form. So it seems that with most pharaohs, they would start work on their tomb very early on to make sure that it was ready for them when they passed on. Right? And here you can see, here's the Step Pyramid of Djoser. Okay, so a later pharaoh then wanted to build a smooth-sided pyramid. And this is the pharaoh Sneferu. So the first attempt to build a smooth-sided pyramid, the way the Egyptians constructed it is they had an inner core, an inner solid core, and that they tried to stack stone blocks around the inner core that would form a smooth-sided triangular shaped pyramid. Problem was the friction between the outer core and the inner core was not great enough, and you can see what happened. The outer core collapsed, right? And so this is the collapsed pyramid of Sneferu. So it was a failure. So they tried again. Right? And what they did this time is they did not have an inner core and outer core. It was solid. As they started to build it, the angle was too steep, and the pyramid started to collapse. So they had to change the angle midway through construction to one that was more shallow. And the end result was a pyramid that had a bent shape. Right? So this is the bent pyramid of Sneferu. And it was a completed pyramid. It had the burial chambers inside of it. Right? But this pyramid was not used. They had to try again to get it right. And on the final try, right, they got the angle right. 52 degrees is this angle right here. You cannot really build any steeper than that. The end result was the first real pyramid, a thing that we would consider to be a real pyramid. Four-sided, solid construction, uniform shape, right? And this is the Red Pyramid of Sneferu. Right? So, pretty amazing that these, that during Sneferu's reign, there were 2 failed attempts and then a final completed pyramid during this one pharaoh's reign. So they had all the mathematics correct after that in terms of the angle, and so construction began then later on with the pyramid Khufu on what would become the largest pyramid, and this is at Gizeh, which is not that far from Cairo. Right? And so looking at these 3 pyramids, the pyramid of Khufu is the largest. Right? It doesn't look like in this picture because it's the furthest away, but the pyramid of Khufu is the largest. The pyramid of his son Khafre is this one, and then is the pyramid of a later pharaoh Menkaure, and you can see the pyramids of his queens. Okay, this is the only representation we have of Khufu anymore. Right? The archaeologists have spent a lot of time examining the pyramids, but also excavating the area around the pyramids to figure out how the pyramids were constructed, the lives of the workers, etc., etc. So archaeologists now have a lot of information on how the pyramids were built. Originally, all the pyramids were completely smooth-sided. They were covered in casing stones on the outside, like this granite block, which was removed from one of the pyramids. So originally they were all completely smooth-sided. Right? So When, people ask you, well, how could the ancient Egyptians have built these pyramids, right? Well, every step of the process has been documented with archaeology, right? So here you can see the pyramids over here, and this is the quarry where they remove the limestone blocks in order to construct the pyramid. What they realized is that, and this is when they looked at some of the interior areas of the pyramid, like here, right, where a later archaeologists tried to blast their way into the pyramid, right, is that they were able to look at the outer area, and they were able to look at the blocks in the inner area. What they noticed is that the outer blocks were very, very uniform. The inner blocks were less uniform. So that is, the blocks that took a lot of time to construct were mainly for the outer layers, but the inner layers were filled with less uniform blocks. That's one of the time-saving measures that they had. But here you can see the quarry. How would they chip out these enormous blocks of limestone? What they did is something simple but ingenious. They carved these divots, you can see here, into the stones. They pounded in wood, and then they soaked the wood in water. The wood expanded, and it split off a block from the rest of the limestone, right? And that's how they were able to get these huge blocks of stone. Then they hauled them up onto the construction site. Originally, the burial chamber was supposed to be under the pyramid, but they constructed this large gallery, which is where the final burial chamber was constructed, right? And here you get an idea of the size of these blocks, right? You look at this individual here. Block is almost up to this person's chest, right? It's 2 tons. These blocks are huge. People try to climb up the pyramids, but they were never meant to be climbed up. The purpose of the pyramids was essentially for the pharaoh to ascend into the heavens and get into the afterlife. These were originally all smooth-sided. The materials were removed later on in history. Okay, and here you can see one of the tunnels, right? The remnants of a tunnel. You can kind of see these huge blocks that were used to support one of the inner chambers. Okay, and here's the pyramid of Khafre, and you can see what it would have looked like on all sides. Those smooth stones at the top. Khafre is the pharaoh of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is a representation of Khafre. That was part of the temple that stood in front of his pyramid. Right? And you could kind of see what the interior burial chamber would have looked like. And for the workers who worked on the pyramids, this is usually the way that they were buried. Some of the overseers were buried a little bit differently. But again, the dryness of the area allowed for the preservation of people naturally. Okay, there's been a lot of theories as to how they get the blocks of stone up to the pyramid site. So one theory is that there was essentially one ramp, and that the ramp got steeper and bigger as the pyramid got higher and higher. This idea of one ramp for the whole thing, not many people think that this is credible, because the final ramp that would be needed to get up to the top would be so huge, right, that it would, some people think that it would be twice the volume of the pyramid itself. So what a lot of people think now is that there was one ramp to start, and then they had these circular ramps going around the sides to haul the stones, to drag the stones up to the top. And some people think that they used internal tunnels in order to do this, so that the ramps were inside the pyramid, not outside. So there's still a little bit of debate as to exactly what construction techniques were used, but you get a little sense of the scale here in terms of how many people it would take to build one of these pyramids. We're talking about thousands, probably just 4,000 people alone to haul these stones into place. And then other thousands of people to do other jobs, right? And we'll talk a little bit about this in just a sec. But what about the mathematics? You know, so some people say, oh, well, the ancient Egyptians would have had a knowledge of pi, you know, 3.14, but that's actually not the case. The geometry involved was definitely at, you know, their disposal, at their fingertips. For example, how'd they get things level, right? How'd they get things perfectly flat? Well, you know, the first thing that they would do is be able to make a square, right? A 90-degree angle made out of wood. How would they do that? They would have two fixed points. They would have a rope with some sort of drawing implement on it. They would draw a curve, like so, part of a circle. They would use the other rope over here, and they would draw a curve. They would connect the intersection of these two curves. The line between these midpoints and the line between the intersection of the curves formed 90-degree angles. Right? Then they would basically take a piece of wood, construct a 90-degree angle, have a weight hanging from it on a table, and this created a level. So if this table was tipping over one way, the weight would basically hang down, not in the middle, but off to the side. Those were some of the simple tools that they used. They could figure out also, you know, the pyramids are oriented roughly north, south, east, west. How would they figure out north and south, east, and west? They're able to do this from the rising and setting of the sun throughout the year and measuring the shadows. Right? So again, this was all within their grasp. We also know some of the names of some of the work groups. Again, they were not slaves, they were paid workers, and they had different names. So in fact, when they were building Menkare's pyramid, one of the groups, they called themselves the Drunkards of Menkare. You know, that was kind of their almost like their team name. And, you know, some of these work groups would brag, you know, we move more blocks than this group, etc., etc. What about moving the blocks? They were not moved on wheels, rollers, right? Actually, you know, this ancient Egyptian depiction of moving this enormous statue gives an idea of probably how they did it. On sleds or sledges with some water, basically as a little bit of lubrication. And that's really what they probably did. Here you can see on some of the blocks, the workers actually wrote the names of some of the groups that they were involved in. The archaeologists have also excavated the workers' quarters next to the pyramid. That is, they've excavated the village for the workers that they lived in while they were working on this construction project. And they have found things such as bakeries and breweries, right? So here you can see this is actually a mold for a loaf of bread. And, you know, this just kind of shows, you know, the infrastructure, the support staff, you could say, that was needed in order to get this project up and running, right? That isn't, you know, when you're talking about a project of this size, it's not just the people hauling the stone, right? It's the people feeding those workers, housing those workers, organizing those workers, right? There are a huge number of people besides just the stone cutters that are needed, right? And so this is one estimation of Khufu's pyramid. 6,700 workers, right? They think something like 1,000 people in the quarries, you know, chipping off stone blocks. 1,000 people on the Nile transporting the blocks, right? 1,000 people, a little over 1,000 people transporting the blocks, right? 1,300 workers in the building yard at the foot of the pyramid. 880 workers on the pyramid flanks on the sides. 200 workers for transporting the granite blocks. 820 workers to position the stone blocks, right? And we're also talking about, again, all of that support staff, logistical staff. You know, we're talking about this is an enormous project, and so the genius of the ancient Egyptians and, you know, of the pharaoh and the bureaucracy of ancient Egypt was the ability to organize something like this. This took a huge amount of organization. It took a huge amount of bureaucracy. It took a huge amount of people keeping track of all these things. Unfortunately, we do not have the documents that detail exactly what was going on, so we can only assume, some of the organization that was needed. Here you can see kind of from some of the documents that were found, kind of get an idea of how these gangs, work groups were broken up into smaller groups and organized, right? So it's almost like a military operation. Generals, colonels, sergeants, right, all the way down to privates. You've got kind of a hierarchical leadership. And this is maybe what it looked like. The granite blocks were brought from further away. The limestone was quarried right there, brought up to the site. So you had this harbor to bring some of the granite from other sites to the pyramid. And here you can see this is maybe what it looked like. Okay, so what you see is that the process of pyramid building was one of trial and error that took a couple hundred years, right? The ancient Egyptians made mistakes, and they learned from their mistakes. So in the beginning, they were building mastabas. The mastabas stacked on each other. Then they constructed the step pyramid of Djoser. Then during Sneferu's reign, they tried to construct a smooth-sided pyramid, had 2 failed attempts, and finally got it right. And then the final largest pyramid was built by Khufu at Gizeh. And here you can kind of see the relative sizes of the pyramids over time, right? And so you can see step pyramid Djoser, collapsed pyramid, bent pyramid, red pyramid, and then the pyramid of Khufu. Right? Some people have asked, and this seems like a strange question, did the Egyptians build the pyramids, or did the pyramids build Egypt? What they mean by this is, when you think about it, in order to construct the pyramids, again, they had to put in all that organization and bureaucracy in place. They had to put it in place or have it in place, ready to go. Right? And so the process of building the pyramids also built up the administration, the bureaucracy, the organization of the Egyptian state itself, right? And so it was not only that the pharaoh and the Egyptian state built the pyramids, but the process of building the pyramids is what also built up the Egyptian state itself. Okay, we saw from the exhibit on the tomb of Tutankhamun that during the New Kingdom, and we're going to talk a little bit about Old, Middle, and New Kingdom, what happens, right? But we're going to kind of skip to the New Kingdom from the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is the period of the pyramids. Those pyramids, were not obviously the best place to put a secret tomb, right? You're kind of advertising that there's treasure there. And so during the New Kingdom, pharaohs constructed their tombs in what became known as the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the Nile. You can see here's Gizeh, further south, right, or upstream on the Nile. And they carved these enormous tombs into the cliff face in order to basically keep their tombs safe from tomb robbers. And a village nearby, by the modern name of Deir el-Medina, you can see right here the archaeological excavations. This was a specialized village for the construction of tombs, the artifacts that would go in the tombs, the artisans who would build and decorate the tombs. So this whole industry, right, or the whole town's economy was based on tomb construction in the Valley of the Kings. And these are elaborate tombs. This shows you one of these tombs. This is the tomb of Seti I. And first you had to carve out these smooth-sided chambers. Then you had to draw. You can see the reliefs of the pharaoh. Then you had to carve down so that the figures would be raised. You carved out everything around it so they would be raised, and then you would paint them. So lots of painstaking work. And as we saw in the exhibit, there's only one pharaoh's tomb that is, for the most part, intact, right? And that is, there are some later pharaoh's tombs, but really the most famous pharaoh's tomb that's mostly intact is the tomb of Tutankhamun, right? And the exhibit gave you a good understanding of Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon, and Howard Carter, the archaeologist, the enormous work, right, and the number of years that it took him to find Tutankhamun's tomb. And I'm going to post a couple of videos, BBC drama that they actually showed clips of in the exhibit. But it's just as a movie, it's a really good movie if you want to see sort of more about King Tut, learn more about Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon. It's a really interesting movie. Right? But there's a certain reason, a specific reason why King Tut's tomb was not looted. And the reason is that King Tut died early in his reign. He was only 18 when he died, and his tomb was not ready. So they used the tomb of his general, and they quickly got it ready for Tutankhamun, and buried him there. There were actually tomb robbers who broke in soon after it was sealed, but they were scared off. It was resealed. And then they started constructing other things in the Valley of the Kings, and the entrance of the tomb was buried by the debris of the later constructions, and then the location was forgotten, right? And it was not marked. So that's really the reason why it remained untouched, and most of the artifacts were found inside, whereas the other tombs of the famous pharaohs were looted. So a lot of the other tombs, like the tomb of Ramses and Seti, they had paintings, but none of the treasure or the artifacts was remaining. Howard Carter, right, basically figured this out through excavation, that process of elimination. You know, he knew this was a later tomb, that he removes this debris. He found stone steps going down. He wired, as we saw in the exhibit, back to Lord Carnarvon, you know, to basically come down as soon as he could. They ascended and cleared out this chamber, got down to the bottom to this sealed door. Howard Carter poked a hole through the door, stuck a candle there to try to see what was there, and as we saw in the exhibit, this is what he saw. This first chamber piled high with all of this treasure. And Howard Carter talks about, you know, first he could see nothing, but then he saw gold everywhere, the glint of gold, right? And so Howard Carter, Carnarvon, Lord Carnarvon's daughter, right, went in to basically take a look around at the tomb. And I will also put a video for you guys to listen. It's only a minute, but it's the actual voice recording of Howard Carter talking about this, and you could kind of see, you know, hear Howard Carter in his own words. Right? So they went to the antechamber, you can see here, and they looked at all the contents, which were really piled high and jumbled in there, again, because they were getting, this was not designed to be King Tut's tomb. Gold beds, right? So we see these beautiful wood beds covered and gilded, boxes inlaid, right? This just shows Tutankhamun as a warrior in his chariot. And you saw in the exhibit, you know, that a chariot was buried in the tomb, right? A golden chariot. You can see Tutankhamun fighting off some of the enemies of ancient Egypt here. These are Canaanite, Semitic speakers in Syria, Canaan, Lebanon, right, that we're going to talk a little bit about as well. His throne, right, with his depicting him and his queen, you can see here, right, and then through the antechamber, right, they found the remains, and you saw a little bit of this as well. The basically miscarried fetuses of Tutankhamun's wife. So these were these twins that that were not born alive, that were then mummified and then placed in their own individual sarcophagi. Then within the burial chamber, right, and this is something you saw that right, I mean, there's this enormous shrine filled that burial chamber. There was not a lot of room between the walls and those shrines, right? And so here you can see them kind of walking around this large shrine. King Tutankhamun's body was nested within this complex nested boxes of shrines, sarcophagi, etc. Howard Carter saw that the seals were intact, so he knew that everything inside was untouched in those shrines. Right? The walls, again, were painted, showing here's Tutankhamun as Osiris, right? And the opening of the mouth ceremony you can see there. Right? They started to open up these shrines, right, one by one, and disassembling them. And within the disassembled shrines was a solid stone sarcophagus, right? So you can see burial chamber, shrine, another shrine, another shrine, another shrine, stone sarcophagus, and then the gold sarcophagi of Tutankhamun. Right? There was a solid gold sarcophagus, right, within the stone sarcophagus, which is pretty amazing. So wood sarcophagi covered in gold, and then a solid gold sarcophagus. So just the sheer amount of gold in there, but we're talking about not just gold, but the craftsmanship that's really unparalleled in the ancient world. This is Howard Carter excavating carefully one of the sarcophagi within another sarcophagus. Right, and here you can see this is what the solid gold sarcophagus actually looks like. And then within that was the mummy of Tutankhamun with the famous death mask, solid gold death mask of Tutankhamun. And this is the mummified remains of Tutankhamun. And next to the burial chamber was the treasury, containing this wooden box covered in gold with the canopic jars holding Tutankhamun's organs, and then also the just more and more treasure. Right? So, pretty amazing amount of wealth, right? And what this shows again is just the sheer amount of material that was buried with Tutankhamun. What about the curse of Tutankhamun? This is kind of a something that's attracted in popular, definitely popular imagination. But essentially, the curse story derived from a couple of things. Mainly, that when Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb, he gave exclusive media rights to the London Times. That meant that all the other papers were getting things secondhand, usually next day. A lot of the newspapers wanted something to write about as well, and so when Lord Carnarvon actually died, they created this story of a curse and basically played it up, whereby anyone who was remotely connected to this project who died, it was said it was the curse of the pharaoh. And what happened was that supposedly Lord Carnarvon, when he was shaving in Cairo after the tomb was already opened, cut himself shaving and got blood poisoning and died in Cairo. And the story is that all the lights went out in Cairo when he died, and his dog back home in England died. Right, but this was sort of the beginnings of this idea, that he was being punished. There was a curse. They even made up this story that the tomb itself had a inscription that talked about a curse, which was untrue. There was no inscription talking about a curse. Other people remotely, that were connected with the opening of the tomb died, and so that sort of gave more credence to this story. This is 1922, but Howard Carter lived a long life. They took him, believe it or not, 10 years of painstaking work to empty the tomb, catalog everything, preserve everything, send it back to the museum in Cairo, right? But he did not pass away because of some unusual circumstances. And Lord Carnarvon's daughter, who was there at the beginning of the opening of the tomb, lived until her 80s, right? So it really is this kind of story that's captured a lot of people's imagination, but it really is a tale of imagination. Okay, after Howard Carter found Tutankhamun's tomb, people then said, nothing left to find, the Valley of the Kings. And then in the 1990s, they found KV5. And KV5 was the tomb complex of Ramses II's sons. It was about 100 sons in here. None of the treasure was found in there, but it showed that there were still things to find in the Valley of the Kings associated with this mortuary complex. And they even found something not too long ago. It was called KV63. All these tombs and features get these numbers KV. But this turned out to be an area for the process of mummification. Okay, so we're just going to take a look now at the overview of Egyptian history. So we have a little bit of idea of, the power of the pharaoh, the pyramids in the Old Kingdom, tomb building later on in the New Kingdom, right? Now we'll just kind of look a little bit at basically the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Right? And these are three different periods. We're really going to focus on, we've talked about the pyramids during the Old Kingdom, we're really going to focus now on the New Kingdom and sort of the ups and downs in Egyptian history. Right? What you see is that at the end of the Old Kingdom there is a collapse. And this period of kind of a downturn in Egyptian history is called an intermediate period. Right? Then Egypt reemerges kind of as a unified state again in what's known as the Middle Kingdom. There's another collapse we'll talk about. This is the second intermediate period. Egypt reemerges yet again under, basically in a new changed form, and this is called the New Kingdom. When you look at the Old Kingdom, ancient Egypt, right, you could see that Egypt was kind of protected on all sides by desert, right? Somewhat protected. Egypt would fight with the Nubians to the south. It would also fight with Libyans in the Libyan desert. The Old Kingdom also, at one point, at different points, moved into the Sinai, right? But by the end of the Old Kingdom, there was a collapse. And some archaeologists have looked at the data pertaining to climate, and they think that there was a long period of drought that actually caused the end of the Old Kingdom. Other people think that drought may have played a part, but there were also political reasons as well. Right? Now what you can see is because Egypt was not at war that much with some of the areas in Mesopotamia, and in Mesopotamia we know city-state was fighting city-state. In Mesopotamia, because there was so much war, the military technology got better and better because of the need to improve upon weapons and armor and things like that. Whereas in Egypt, the armor, the weapons, pretty much stayed the same. So the Egyptians in the Old Kingdom did not have chariots. They had simple bows. They did not have very complex bronze armor. Right? And this is what the Egyptian army would have looked like during the Old Kingdom. Right? So at the end of the Middle Kingdom, right, the Old Kingdom, there's a collapse, right? Some think by climate. There's a reemergence in the Middle Kingdom. This is like what the army would look like during the Middle Kingdom as well. Egypt was invaded. It was invaded by people from this area, right? These Syrians, Canaanites, people who related to the Mesopotamians here, who had chariots pulled by horses, who had bronze armor, bronze weapons, who had bows that were even more powerful than Egyptian bows. And they invaded and took over this portion of Egypt. Right? And these people were known as the Hyksos, which is basically Egyptian for foreign rulers. And during this second intermediate period, the Egyptians tried to kick out the Hyksos. And you could see that some pharaohs even died in battle trying to fight the Hyksos. Right? So this is a pharaoh, Seqenenre Tao II, and you can see these gashes to his head on his mummy that were inflicted in battle with the Hyksos. So after they kicked out the Hyksos, right, this is basically the beginning of the New Kingdom. After they kick out the Hyksos and they restore Egyptian rule, the Egyptians wanted to prevent anything like that invasion from ever happening again. So the way that they did this was to create an empire. So New Kingdom Egypt is different from the preceding periods of Egypt because it's really a period of empire building. To prevent invasion from this area, they decided to take over this area, or at least weaken the states in this area. And so the New Kingdom was a period of expansion, was a period of empire building, and during this period, they came up against another empire, and this was the empire of the Hittites, who are up here in Turkey, that we're going to learn about in like a week or two. And these two empires went head-to-head in a battle right here in what's now Syria. Right? These were kind of the two, during this New Kingdom period, these were the two major powers in the area, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire. And they fought a battle right where their empires met. All right, a lot of the pharaohs in the New Kingdom are pretty well known. We'll just mention a couple. Hatshepsut. Some of you may have heard of the pharaoh Hatshepsut. She is, well, I kind of gave it away, but the unusual thing about this pharaoh is that she was a woman. Right? She took over after her husband died. And you can see, depicting herself as a pharaoh, even with the false beard there. Next pharaoh was Thutmose III. He's famous because he expanded the Empire of Egypt. He fought a famous battle at the site of Megiddo. The mound of Megiddo, or Har Megiddo, is where we get the term Armageddon, right? Because so many battles have been fought at this mound, but he was able to weaken and take over this city, which is now in Israel, of Megiddo. Right? Another pharaoh came after, Akhenaten. This is the father of Tutankhamun and his wife Nefertiti, you can see here. Akhenaten was not popular with many of the religious establishment because he focused worship on a sun god known as Aten, which you can see in his name. And the artwork from this period is unusual. It typically shows a sun with these rays coming down. You can see Akhenaten, you can see Nefertiti. When Tutankhamun became pharaoh after Akhenaten, he restored the worship of Amun and rejected the worship of Aten. Right? And that's why he's called Tutankhamun. Right? The Amun is now back in the pharaoh's names. Okay, probably the most famous pharaoh, I think. Well, probably Tutankhamun's the most famous because of his tomb. Right? But maybe after Tutankhamun, the second most famous pharaoh was Ramses II. Ramses II was a huge builder in ancient Egypt. Right? He constructed many buildings. One of the things that he's famous for is that early on in his reign, he fought a major battle against the Hittites at a town called Kadesh. And this was very early on in his reign. He ruled for 60 more years after this battle. And his reign after this was basically of peace. Right? But he played up the fact that he claims he won this battle. And this was a great victory for him. In fact, it was more of a stalemate. Right? But the Hittites had conquered a city of Kadesh. Ramses came up with his army to basically defeat the Hittites. And two Bedouin basically told Ramses that the Hittite army had fled. Once they heard the Egyptians were there, they fled. They were no longer there. So Ramses let his guard down. Right, his army was marching. They set up camp. A lot of his army was still behind him. They found two Hittites. Right, and this is what we today call advanced interrogation techniques. Right, but out of these two spies, they found out that the Hittite army was actually waiting to surprise the Egyptian army. And that's when the Hittite army launched their attack with chariots and ran right through Ramses' camp. And it was at this point that the Hittites could have won the battle. But two things changed the outcome of the battle. One, the Hittite soldiers, once they had entered the Egyptian camp, started to loot the dead Egyptian soldiers. The second thing is that Ramses organized a counterattack. And so he was able to push out the Hittites, reinforcements showed up, and basically it was a stalemate at the end of the battle, and the Hittites and the Egyptians created a peace treaty between them. Right? And this is a copy of one of the peace treaties. So there's actually a replica of this document in the United Nations building, and it's the label under it says the first peace treaty in history. Right? And so even though he portrays himself in all of his work as this great warrior king, really what his reign is known for is 60 years of peace. He went about constructing many buildings in ancient Egypt. The most famous is probably the temple Abu Simbel, which depicts Ramses as a god in 4 different statues. There's a long hallway. Inside Abu Simbel are depictions of Ramses at the Battle of Kadesh. Right? You can see kind of here, more statues here. And then at the very back are statues of Ramses and 4 gods. And on one specific day of the year, the light shines upon, you can see Amun and Horus and Ramses, and Ta is here in the shadows. Some of the other buildings of Ramses, you can see, so he built many temples, and even took credit for some of the work of other pharaohs by chiseling their names out and putting his names in. And supposedly lived until his 90s. So really long reign, probably one of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history. Right? So, here we can see kind of the ups and downs of Egyptian civilization. But from the beginnings of Egyptian civilization, really up until the Roman Empire, we're talking now about 3,000 years. You really had the same religion, same culture, same language, same government system, same culture for that period of time. So just really a huge longevity in ancient Egypt. And with the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, again, you see that there's some ups and downs. So the Old Kingdom was the period of the pyramids. At the end of the Old Kingdom, there's a collapse. Egypt reemerges in the Middle Kingdom. Then there's an invasion of outsiders who take over Egypt. Egypt goes on the offensive, adopts the weaponry of these invaders, and creates an empire, and that's the New Kingdom. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the Indus River Valley, the area which is now India and Pakistan.